From about 2014 to 2016, the developer Platinum Games made their trilogy of licensed titles that have been bullied online ever since. Mostly because the studio took a hard turn from making original games, like that one Devil May Cry game where Dante becomes a BDSM librarian, or the ever so underrated high-octane shooter Vanquish, both of which were directed by Capcom alumni Hideki Kamiya and Shinji Mikami respectively. And if you've been in the space or just know Capcom games at all, then hearing those names will give an immediate picture in your mind. Flashy, stylish, and most importantly, new games were Platinum's bread and butter. So when they delved into making games based on cartoons like The Legend of Korra and Transformers for Activision of all people, the gamer corners of the internet sort of lit on fire for a little. And you can't really blame them for the most part. Just from what I've played here on this channel, any game that has Activision as a publisher is as good as dead. But it's their final game in the trilogy, Ninja Turtles: Mutants in Manhattan, that was the most negatively received by far, with a surprising amount of people giving it the moniker of Platinum's worst game at launch. And as a Turtles fan and digital dumpster diver, I had to sort of see this for myself. As usual with these old licensed games, their prices are way too fucking high. Most copies online vary from $40 to $50, especially for the PS4 and Xbox One, but I went to my local GameStop for the first time this century and was able to find a PS3 copy for only 20 bucks. So shouts out to them, I guess. Let's see if they're still open in a year. The plot of the game could literally be an episode of the cartoon series, which is pretty par for the course for Platinum. Shredder and Krang are gonna do a space terrorism, so now our 4 adolescent reptiles have to stop them. When I wrote the script, I was like 90% sure that turtles were amphibians until I looked it up. So now the alliteration is just all fucked. I really appreciate that there's some B and C list villains here like Slash, Armagon, and Wingnut. That really is his name, I promise. Much like the other small-scaled Turtles game Out of the Shadows, which only released 3 years prior to this, Mutants in Manhattan is also loosely based on a then-new TMNT property, this time being the IDW comics, specifically the art of Mateus Santaluco. His style is translated extremely well to a 3D cel-shaded game, and for a cross-gen title released in 2016, it doesn't look or run half bad at all. I was especially concerned since the PS3 is the weakest console it was released on, but the performance was relatively consistent, regardless of all the particle effects on screen. And the models are able to capture the look of the IDW series for the most part. Most of the characters look great, but then there's Splinter, who he looks like a fucking creepypasta character. Shredder looks fine, it just looks like he's been using steroids in preparation for his bodybuilding competition. This man's body is fucking deep. And I have to agree that the turtles' noses look a bit off, especially when they look head-on to the camera. It's fucking weird. The story was written by one of the comic writers, Tom Waltz, and while there's some references to that continuity, like Slash being brainwashed or April being a scientist, it all really whittles down to a very video gamey plot of just fighting classic villains. I will say that as a Turtles story, it's a lot of fun, although the main characters feel way too serious to the point where they all feel a little bit samey, save for the occasional moment that Donnie said something about science or Raph gets a little upset, but the biggest missed mark here is Michelangelo. Because unfortunately, like a lot of other Turtles media at the time, Mikey is just written as the dumb one. And that's the bit for the entire game. Flanderization aside, the voice acting is really well done. Leonardo sounded a little familiar, and that's because he's voiced by Nolan North, Mr. Video Game Deadpool himself. He also voices Splinter as well as Shredder, and I couldn't fucking tell. That's especially interesting to me since he voiced Raphael in TMNT from 2007, and he was kind of one of the best parts of that movie and its game adaptation, so it's interesting to me that not enough Turtle fans really talk about him returning to the series and playing 3 roles nonetheless. The entire cast is star-studded. Ashley Birch as April, Steve Blum as Krang, Mick Wingert, Robbie Damon, and Gavin Hammond as Raph, Donnie, and Mikey respectively, and everybody does a fantastic job. The music is also fucking banging here, but that's pretty par for the course for Platinum at this point. Altogether, there's only 9 levels of the game, all of which are set in different locations and have their own bosses at the end. But to get to the boss, you have to fill up this bar by completing enough tasks in the stage, mostly consisting of killing Foot Ninja or defusing bombs. Usually I'd immediately jump into combat, but the levels here are kind of impressive, specifically with how large some of them can be. Some are segmented like the sewers, the train stations, and the TCRI labs, but the stages set in the city are just one wide open area you can run around in. The amount of detail given to these streets and buildings is kind of insane. I do wish the streets had civilians or any sort of life at all outside of Foot Ninja. I feel like not having a Turtles game with a lively New York has been a huge missed opportunity. It's also a shame that there's not many secrets or collectibles you can find in the levels, outside of the comic book covers for the IDW run, which you can't read. And the different tasks that you're given can get a little repetitive, which is by far the biggest criticism for this game. And while they really do whittle down to those two things, not all of them are the same. I liked finding the hideouts throughout the city, and I enjoyed whenever I was asked to transport a bomb, specifically when I got to roll it like a Katamari. Plus, whenever you play a level, most of the objectives are randomized, so there's at least an attempt to try to change things up. But like most other games in Platinum's repertoire, what really sells the game is the combat. And I gotta say, while it's fun, it's nowhere near as in depth as you'd expect. It's here with the game's director, Hiro Shirahama, who also directed the one and only Resident Evil Dead Aim. Shirahama said that the team really wanted to hone in on the source material. From watching both the retro and the then modern Nick shows, as well as playing games on the Super Famicom like Turtles in Time, I couldn't find Shirahama directly saying that the team wanted this game to be a beat-em-up, but it's very clear that the final product leans more towards that genre than a character action game. This is important since Platinum's character action games are known for having lots of combos, occasional RPG mechanics, and lots of pace breakers, often changing up the way the game is played multiple times within one level. Often switching from hacking and slashing to even a race or a turret section. Just the opening of Nier Automata changes gameplay styles like 5 times within the first hour, while Mutants is much closer to an old-fashioned beat-em-up. There aren't really elaborate combos. You press square for regular attack, triangle for heavy, you can block and parry, as well as rely on items and special attacks to help you out. Also, you aren't penalized for using items here. As a matter of fact, there's a shop that you can buy more items from or switch them out, which is not the Platinum way. Usually these games dock points for you to use them at all. Even for a beat 'em up, there's some things that you'd expect to be here, like obtaining new combos, that just aren't. Which means that playing Mutants in Manhattan can get very repetitive in longer play sessions, but Devastation had a similar problem and that game is amazing. There are pace breakers and set pieces in Mutants, but they're far and few between. Like an entire level where you have to fight as a mecha robot, but you fall off the robot if you're hit once, so it's a little annoying, or fighting on top of a subway train, which is becoming somewhat of a common theme in these Turtles games. It may seem like a step back for some, considering the variety Platinum's games usually have, and while there's some parts that I wish were included, the emphasis on just fighting dudes across rooftops is something I could totally get on board with. On paper, this is just like the myriad of other TMNT games that have been released before, many of which I've talked about. The difference here is the fast-paced combat, as well as a knack for comic book aesthetics mixed with the cell shading look. While there's not much variety in what attacks you can do, for a button masher, the combat itself was still fun. Switching between the turtles is smooth, and each of them have their own exclusive skills, like Mikey's ability to recharge his brother's abilities or Leo's slowdown mechanic, both of which make for pretty fun team management. On normal, the game puts up a decent challenge despite being very forgiving with health items, as well as the ability to revive your turtles in this pizza eating minigame that's kind of hard to trigger in single player. The best part of Mutants in Manhattan is the boss fights, each of which plays completely differently with their own movesets, which isn't something you always see in hack and slash games. My absolute favorites were probably Karai and Shredder, but what makes the boss fights here even better is the inclusion of the secret bosses. If you're doing really well in a level, then during the boss fight, another one will just randomly show up. They can only be encountered on a second playthrough, and whether they're triggered or not depends entirely on your scores as well as what difficulty you're playing. The true final boss, a fight with Super Shredder, is one of these secret bosses. But the flip side of this randomized system is that you can play a 20 or so minute level only to not fight the secret boss at all, because you gotta be in a random encounter or something, which is what happened to me. Despite playing the final mission 3 different times, I wasn't able to unlock the Super Shredder fight, and as much as I like this game, I am not playing it a 4th. There's some more minor gripes that I have. Each level starts out with an extremely small amount of health bars, and depending on how well you do in combat leading up to the boss, you can up your max health. But the trade-off is that it's only for that stage. Once you move on to the next stage, it's back down to your base health. I think what makes the game feel repetitive is the lack of permanent upgrades. There's no changes to your stats, there's a limit to the amount of charms that you can use on normal mode, which is just 1, as well as the lack of new combos. So save for leveling up your special attacks to be stronger with shorter cooldown times, there's no growth or tangible reason to play this game on higher difficulties, unless you just want to struggle alongside your friends. This all probably has to do with Mutants in Manhattan being designed with online co-op in mind, which, as much as I dislike games that attempt to meld single player and multiplayer into one, is pretty smart for this property. Between the randomized tasks and secret bosses, it feels like Mutants was built to be enjoyed by a group of friends. It's a bit ridiculous that there's absolutely no local co-op at all, not even 2-player. There isn't even a way to play LAN on PC, which feels like an insane missed opportunity. The game also references all your base are belong to us out of nowhere. I guess it makes a little bit more sense here, but I don't know what the fuck it is with licensed games and referencing decades-old internet humor. So yeah, it's not perfect. But the worst Platinum game ever made isn't all that bad. Well, it looks like I'm in the minority. Again, despite initially getting positive previews from a 20 or so minute play session, when the full game was released, critics and fans hated Mutants in Manhattan. The game would be absolutely beaten to a pulp by critics, and its treatment by its publisher was no better. Just 6 months later, the character models for the Turtles would be dragged and dropped into Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5, which is an entirely different clusterfuck by Activision that deserves its own separate video. Then, the following January, after only being on sale for just 7 months, Activision would pull not only Mutants in Manhattan, but Out of the Shadows and a ton of other games from digital sales, since their publishing deals with Nickelodeon as well as Marvel and Tony Hawk were all expiring around the same time frame. When it came to Mutants being delisted, an article or two were written essentially saying good riddance to Platinum's red-headed stepchild, and that was sort of the last nail in the coffin. So why exactly did Mutants in Manhattan get left out to die in the cold? Well, outside of the obvious criticism towards stuff like the repetitive gameplay, there's a few reasons that I can cook up in my mind. Without trying to sound like a fucking conspiracy theorist, what other Platinum game released in 2016? Oh God, no! Platinum's gold streak was starting to turn brown, and while opinions on their games varied somewhat, the general consensus was that their better days were behind them for now. I'm not trying to imply that these reviews were incorrect. I really do believe that these people do not like this game, but especially with some of the low scores given, it makes me wonder if these reviews are more so criticizing the state of Platinum Games as a developer, and less about how much they didn't enjoy Mutants in Manhattan itself. Part of why I enjoy talking about older games is just the nature of the passage of time. Not only is it truly easier to enjoy something when you don't have someone complaining in your ear from every angle, but the topic of price is completely irrelevant for most cases. You can spend as much, or as little, as you'd like on old video games. So all that's really left to hone in on is the game itself. And if this is the worst Platinum has to offer, then they're a better developer than I give them credit for. Even if the decision to make these games was just the devs keeping the lights on while also trying to fund future passion projects, it's clear that they did their homework and at least attempted to do right, even if there's clear missteps. Where it lacks in combat depth, it excels in visual presentation, levels, and boss encounters. While it being taken down from digital stores is sad, thankfully it was released physically, unlike a lot of other delisted games I've talked about. Unlike the Simpsons video, the Ninja Turtle rights have been in a much better place since the release of Shredder's Revenge. And of course, there's been no end at Platinum's amazing output recently. Some may look back at this era as a waste of resources, but those people are fucking cowards. Hey, it's like your parents. Sure, they're divorced and it's all your fault, but at least you get 2 Christmases now. Don't forget to share this video to the Polar Express subreddit.
Discover why the critics are calling the Polar Express the greatest holiday ride ever. A classic. There's never been a Christmas adventure like this. Tom Hanks, The Polar Express. Rated G. Now playing. We are Ninja Turtles.